Happy Thanksgiving. The book that our group read is titled Too Expensive to Treat: Finitude, Tragedy in the Neonatal ICU by Charles C. Camosy. I found it an engaging book to read and follow, although the content was challenging on a number of fronts. The purpose of this video is to outline what our group believes to be the main arguments of the book. Group members include myself, Shar Rotvold, Brian Dyer, and Levi Flood. Let me start with the author's voice. Camosy begins the book by stating, in the opening sentence of the introduction, this book is about moral tragedy. That's a pretty broad and bold statement to make, one that drew me in right away. In reading through the book, it becomes apparent quickly that the tragedy he's referring to involves the tragic reality in our country of an unlimited number of medical needs and yet a limited availability of resources that are available to meet those needs. A complicated reality created in part by technological advances in our healthcare system, and also by the rising costs and complicated structures of our nation's healthcare system. As a result of these realities, tragic decisions must be made regarding who and what to treat first, at what cost, and at whose expense. Camosy chooses to focus this book on neonatal intensive care in our country, abbreviated as NICU, for the remainder of this presentation. Because, as he argues and concludes, a growing and disproportionate amount of resources are allocated to this slice of healthcare, to the detriment of many, many others who are also in great need of care and resources. The bioethical decision-making model that Camosy supports is the Catholic social quality of life model, which considers the moral status of persons in general, as well as broad social considerations such as cost or resource allocation. The book, to a large extent, responds to, either affirmatively or critically, this decision-making lens. Camosy indicates that the most important issues to consider in neonatal bioethics are social in nature, as resources allocated to the NICU have a direct impact on our entire healthcare system. Camosy's bottom line is that there are a disproportionate amount of funds allocated for NICUs at the tragic expense of many others, primarily the poor and minorities. Specifically, our healthcare system supports an unjust distribution of resources, particularly Medicaid dollars, with those on the margins, the poor, the elderly, the disabled, and those of non-European descent, receiving a lesser share of resources. The moral status of infants is a lengthy discussion, one that I hadn't really engaged in before. Of course, babies have a moral status from the very time of conception, I have always thought. But of course the conversation is much more involved than that statement. Much time could be and has been spent on discussing the moral status of an infant, but in the end, the same could be true of many other groups. How about the disabled, or the elderly, or someone with Alzheimer's disease, or someone in a coma? How do we determine moral status and full personhood? How we allocate health care resources does indeed depend, at least to a degree, on how we answer those questions. Indeed, not too long ago, it was believed that people of non-European descent might not be full persons with the same moral value as those of us with fair skin and hair. As unbelievable as it sounds to even say that out loud, in some ways and to a greater degree than we would like to admit, designations such as these are being made even today, with minorities, the poor, the disabled, or the elderly living on the periphery of dependable, trustworthy, and capable care. At some point, I have heard, those we consider ethnic minorities today might very well be the majority in our nation in the future. I wonder what things will look like then. From a Christian perspective, all human beings are full persons, created in the image of God. Imago Dei we all are, regardless of skin color, socioeconomic status, or physical or mental health. One decision-making framework that Camosy outlines is that of triage, and this is a framework that we found helpful. Basically, triage situations are those that occur in a crisis, where multiple considerations occur at the same time and a decision regarding treatment must be made. Triage may occur either in an individual who is facing multiple health crises simultaneously, or else in an event where a number of people are injured and in need of care at the same time. Camosi paints the picture of a military battlefield in bringing this to life and asks us to consider a military medic walking a battlefield in the aftermath of a tragedy, a battlefield littered with wounded soldiers, and perhaps civilians as well. What is he or she to do? Who receives treatment first, and who is left to suffer or die? All injured persons are in need of and deserving care, and yet the medic cannot treat everyone. Tragic decisions must be made, and quite likely, some will die as a result. But how are these decisions made? Are they made randomly? Does the medic choose to care for a friend over a stranger, or the one expressing the most amount of pain? How in the world can you pass by someone who is crying out for help? Although this isn't a perfect parallel by any means, Camosi's point is well made. There are indeed decisions like this being made on a daily basis in our healthcare system, whether consciously or not. People who are suffering and in legitimate need of care are indeed being passed by. The questions we need to ask ourselves are, how are decisions made regarding who to treat and in what order? Are they made emotionally? Are they made randomly? Is it even possible to establish hard and fast rules to govern how these decisions should be made? Is there any element of grace extended to the medical professional to consider things on a case-by-case basis? Or do we ask ourselves and the professionals to put aside personal feelings and opinions in order to ensure a fair and equitable distribution of care? Camosi talks at length about Medicare allocation and the unjust ways in which these dollars are distributed. It does appear clear that this needs to be addressed in some way. One issue that our group felt he didn't address as well is the crazy costs of medical care in our country. We can talk all day about reallocating funds, but at the end of the day, wouldn't it be a more effective fix to find a way to reduce medical costs? Other countries seem to have found a way to do this, so perhaps we would benefit by looking to them and considering a significant overhaul in our healthcare system and funding in general. We do not presume to have any answers to this, other than to suggest that we humbly look at how those around us operate. In the end, Camosi's heart is to see healthcare reform occur, bringing a more equitable distribution of resources to people of all ages, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, and walks of life. Specifically, the proposal he advocates would limit what he refers to as a culture of overtreatment in the NICU. He goes so far as to suggest that we make it illegal to treat imperiled babies who likely will not benefit from treatment, even while acknowledging that in doing so, we are asking ourselves to adopt the least tragic choice in situations where only tragic choices exist. Of course, this is a difficult pill to swallow because, as I see it, babies tug at our heartstrings to a greater degree than any other group of people. Fair or not, suggesting that the NICU receive lesser dollars will likely be an uphill battle. But Camosi would argue that for the benefit of a broader inclusion of care for all people, it is a necessary one to fight. In conclusion, Camosi has opened up and dared to address one of the key issues in our country today, healthcare. He has done so by daring to criticize an aspect of healthcare that I'm guessing most others wouldn't think of critiquing, the NICU. From an economical standpoint, this is a highly profitable segment of our healthcare system. And from an emotional standpoint, messing with the lives of babies isn't a place anyone wants to go. I did feel, personally, at the close of the book, that he might have been looking for shock value by targeting innocent babies. Why couldn't he have written the same premise from the perspective of an elderly person facing multiple health crises? Quite simply, because that wouldn't have made the point nearly as well. He is stating as objectively as possible the tragedy that does indeed exist, the decisions that are indeed made on a daily basis, often the least tragic in a series of tragic choices. Seeing these choices through Jesus' eyes, acknowledging the inherent value of all who are made in the Imago Dei, may not make decisions any easier, but they may in fact make things more equitable.